Hello, we're going to begin with chapter 14, the heart. And let's look at the objectives that we want to concentrate on for this section. So if you're looking at the syllabus, if you look at, number 6, this portion starts with objective 6, discuss the location and membranes of the heart. 7, identify the structures of the heart and describe the function of each. 8, describe the vasculature of the heart and its importance in heart disease. 9, trace the conduction pathway of the heart. And then actually, if you look on week 8, part 2, identify the normal cardiac cycle and discuss the physiology of contraction in the heart belong to this heart section. So I just saw that I really need to fix that. But so this is from objective 6 to then there's 1, 2 on the next page, and then there's actually 3 that belong with this section. So I can clear that up if there's any problems, concerns with that. But if you just get it laid out there so you can see it, and that's what we're going to be going over in this chapter. So we already know where the location of the heart is because we learned that when we were talking about the locations of things in the body. And it's what they say is it's about the size of a fist, like your fist. And the heart lies in the thoracic cavity in the mediastinum. The heart tilts toward the left. 2/3 of it extends to the left of the body's midline. And the broadest part of the heart, the base, is at the upper right. And the pointed end, the apex, is at the lower left. The point of maximum impulse, where the strongest beat can be felt, is located at the apex. And that would be right there. The great vessels enter and leave the heart at the base. So this right upper part here. So we're going to look at the heart structures. There's a double-walled sac called the pericardium surrounding the heart. It is anchored to surrounding structures by ligaments and tissue. The pericardium has 2 layers. The outermost is the fibrous pericardium, a loose-fitting sac of strong connective tissue, and the serous pericardium, which covers the heart surface. Serous meaning it is just fluid with it's like without any blood cells or anything like that. It's serous, and it covers the heart's surface. So let's look on page 274 where it really blows this up, and it shows some characteristics of these structures. And then on the next slide, you'll see this broken, taken out and really amplified or magnified. And you can see the endocardium, the myocardium, and the epicardium, the visceral layer. So you've got the parietal layer and the pericardial cavity here. So at the heart's base, the serous pericardium folds back on itself to form the parietal layer, which lines the inside of the fibrous pericardium, and the visceral layer, which covers the heart surface. So we know everything that's visceral is going to be on the surface of the organ itself. Parietal is going to be on the other part, which is in this case the pericardium, and then there's going to be a separation, and where you have the pericardial cavity. It's between the 2 layers. It contains a small amount of serous fluid that helps prevent friction as the heart beats. And then the heart wall has 3 layers. The endocardium lines the chambers, covers the valves, and continues into the vessels. It consists of a thin layer of squamous epithelial cells. And the myocardium composed of cardiac muscle, forms the middle layer. It is the thickest of the three layers and performs the work of the heart. And the epicardium, which consists of a thin layer of squamous epithelial cells, covers the heart's surface. The epicardium is the visceral layer of the serous pericardium. So visceral means it lines the organ. So the heart chambers, that's on page 275. So the heart contains 4 hollow chambers: the atria, the upper chambers, and the ventricles, the lower chambers. The atria serve as reservoirs. They receive blood from the body or the lungs, and they're separated by the intraatrial septum. So here's the intraatrial septum. And here's the left atrium, and here is the right atrium. The walls of the atria are not as thick as the walls of the ventricles because the atria move blood only a short distance from the atria to the ventricles. The ventricles receive blood from the atria, and these are the ventricles. This is the right ventricle, and this is the left ventricle, this area here. So the ventricles receive blood from the atria, from the chambers on the top, and they pump it either to the lungs. The right ventricle pumps it to the lungs, or the body. The left ventricle pumps it to the body, and they're separated by the interventricular septum. This is the interventricular septum right here. It's a thicker wall. Because the ventricles pump blood, they must generate more force than the atria. Therefore, the walls of ventricles are thicker than those of the atria. Because the left ventricle must generate force to push blood throughout the body, its walls are thicker than those of the right ventricle. So you can see that here. This is the left ventricle. The ventricle pushes the blood out through the aorta here. And then this on the right ventricle pushes it out to the lungs. The great vessels, the superior and the inferior vena cava, the pulmonary artery, four pulmonary veins, and the aorta transport blood to and from the heart. They're strands of fibrous connective tissue called chordae tendineae. They extend from conical papillary muscles on the floor of the ventricle to the valve cusps. Papillary muscles contract with the ventricles, pulling on the chordae tendineae and anchoring the valve cusps in the proper position. So if you look on page 275, it goes over all that information. We're going to move on to the heart valves. But first, let's look at the question. What's the name of the sac surrounding the heart? That's right. It's the pericardium. The endocardium, the myocardium, and the epicardium are the 3 layers of the heart wall. So the heart valves each of the heart's 4 valves are formed by 2 or 3 flaps of tissue called cusps or leaflets. The atrioventricular or AV valves regulate flow between the atria and the ventricles. There are 2 semilunar valves that regulate flow between the ventricles and the great arteries. The right AV valve, also called the tricuspid valve because it has 3 leaflets, prevents backflow from the right ventricle to the right atrium. The left AV valve, also called the bicuspid valve because it has 2 leaflets, or the mitral valve, prevents backflow from the left ventricle to the left atrium. Semilunar valves are the pulmonary and aortic valves. The pulmonary valve prevents backflow from the pulmonary artery to the right ventricle, and the aortic valve prevents backflow from the aorta to the left ventricle. If you are having problems with a lot of this terminology, I suggest you get your workbook out now and look at and maybe do some labeling and get an idea of where these structures are that we're talking about, and get some more familiar with that. So the heart skeleton is a semi-rigid fibrous connective tissue called the skeleton of the heart, which encircles each valve. The skeleton supports the heart and keeps the valves from stretching. It also provides insulation between the atria and the ventricles, preventing electrical impulses from reaching the ventricles other than through a normal conduction pathway, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. So when the heart valves close, they produce vibrations that can be heard with a stethoscope on the body surface. Think of how a door closing makes a sound. By listening in key areas, the sounds made by the individual valves can be identified. In the aortic area, the second intercostal space, right sternal border. The pulmonic area, the second intercostal space, the left sternal border. The tricuspid area, fourth or fifth intercostal space, left sternal border, and the mitral area, or the apex, the fifth intercostal space, left midclavicular line. So this is really number 4 is where we're usually listening to the heart sounds. So which heart valve controls the flow of blood between the left atrium and the left ventricle? So left atrium and left ventricle, that is D, or the mitral valve. The pulmonary valve prevents backflow from the pulmonary artery to the right ventricle. The aortic valve prevents backflow from the aorta to the left ventricle, and the tricuspid valve prevents backflow from the right ventricle to the right atrium. So there we go. So blood flowing through the heart. There's no connection between the right and left sides of the heart. They are actually separate pumps, and they could be anywhere. But the beauty of the design is that they're together so that they work together, and the electrical conduction pathway, and so that they contract together and move together, but they are actually separate pumps. The two sides work together to ensure that the organs and tissues of the body receive an adequate supply of oxygenated blood. Both the right and left atria contract at the same time, as do both ventricles. So, number 1, the right atrium receives deoxygenated blood returning from the body through the superior and inferior vena cava. The problem I have with that word is that deoxygenated may say to you there's no oxygen in it, and that's not accurate. There is always oxygen in blood. There is less oxygen in venous blood, and there is more oxygen in the blood that comes straight back from the lungs and goes throughout our body through the arteries. But there's still oxygen there. And this is what makes possible, that's what makes doing compressions alone, just moving the blood with the oxygen that's in it, it's about 70%, which is not going to help us very much. It's not going to help us stay alive very much, but if we can move that oxygen around, it will still help. It will still help in circulation. So we're going to look at this animation here in a second, but we'll just go to the next, to 3 and 4. So 3, after filling, the right ventricle contracts and it forces the pulmonary valve open. So this is the right here is the superior vena cava. The inferior vena cava goes to the right atria through the tricuspid valve, and then it goes up through the pulmonary artery and through the pulmonary valve. So the right ventricle contracts, it forces the pulmonary valve open. Blood's pumped into the right and left pulmonary arteries and onto the lungs. So the right and left pulmonary arteries and onto the lungs. After the right ventricle empties, the pulmonary valve closes and it prevents the blood from flowing backward into the ventricle. Number 4, after replenishing its supply of oxygen and cleansing itself of carbon dioxide in the lungs, and now it's full of oxygen. It's 95 to 100% oxygenated. The blood enters the pulmonary veins and returns to the heart through the left atrium. So it goes to the lungs now, it comes back, and it's nice and red now. It's full of oxygen, and here it goes through the mitral valve into left ventricle, and then it goes to the aortic valves and into the body. So number 5, when the left atrium is full, it contracts. This forces the mitral or bicuspid valve open and blood is pumped into the left ventricle. When the left ventricle is full, the mitral valve closes to prevent backflow. The ventricle then contracts, forcing the aortic valve to open, allowing blood to flow into the aorta. From there, oxygenated blood is distributed to every organ in the body. So again, this is now oxygenated blood. It goes through the left atrium, through the mitral valve, through the left ventricle, through the aorta, to every part of the body. So these two pictures shows here it goes from the left atrium to the left ventricle, and here it shows it's going from the left ventricle through the aorta and then all over the body. So please look at the animation on the blood through the heart. And also review pages 278 and 279. It goes step by step, just like we went through here, showing how the blood goes from the superior and inferior vena cava through the right atria, through the tricuspid valve, the right ventricle, through the pulmonary valve, pulmonary arteries, to the lungs, from the lungs back through the pulmonary veins into the left atria, through the mitral valve, the left ventricle, then up to through the aorta to every part of the body. So review that and review it. It may take several times. It may take going to your workbook and sketching this out, and and telling yourself how that works as you draw it out. So now we're going to look at the coronary circulation. So corona means heart, and the coronary veins, if you held the heart upside down, it looks like a crown, and especially in ancient days, looks like an ancient days crown. And so the first thing that the heart does, the first thing that comes out of the aorta are the coronary arteries, and so that they have the best blood, the freshest blood is going to go and feed the heart itself. So the heart has its own vascular system called coronary circulation to keep it supplied with oxygenated blood. Excuse me. The coronary arteries deliver oxygenated blood to the myocardium. Cardiac veins collect deoxygenated blood. The right and left coronary arteries arise from the ascending aorta. First thing right out of the aorta are the right and left coronary arteries, and the right coronary artery supplies blood to the right atrium, part of the left atrium, most of the right ventricle, and the inferior part of the left ventricle. The left coronary artery supplies blood to the left atrium, most of the left ventricle, and most of the interventricular septum. This artery branches into the anterior descending and circumflex arteries. Most cardiac veins empty into the coronary sinus, which returns the blood to the right atrium, except for the anterior cardiac veins, which empty directly into the right atrium. Coronary arteries receive blood when ventricles relax. Because the left ventricle performs most of the heart's work, it receives the greatest amount of blood. It's only fair. So which great vessel supplies blood to the right atrium? That would be A, the superior and inferior vena cava. So let's look at cardiac conduction. Now there's an animation on cardiac conduction, and anytime you see these animations, you want to watch them, and a picture is worth 1,000 words. So go ahead and go through that animation, and I will go through this as well. So the heart contains special pacemaker cells, and it allows it to contract spontaneously or automatically. Because the heart beats regularly, it is said to have rhythmicity. It's rhythmic. The electrical impulses generated by the heart follow a specific route through the myocardium. Normal cardiac impulses arise in the sinoatrial or SA node. It's shown in gold. An intra-atrial bundle of conducting fibers rapidly conducts the impulses to the left atrium, and both atria begin to contract. That's shown in yellow. When the impulse enters the atrioventricular or AV node, shown in teal, it slows considerably to allow the atria time to contract completely and the ventricles to fill with blood. The heart skeleton insulates the ventricles, ensuring that only impulses passing through the AV node can enter. Now, after passing through the AV node, the impulse picks up speed. It then travels down the bundle of His, also called the AV bundle, shown in purple. The AV bundle branches into right and left bundle branches, shown in red. Purkinje fibers conduct the impulses throughout the muscles of both ventricles, causing them to contract almost simultaneously. That's shown in blue. The SA node, the primary pacemaker, fires at 60 to 80 beats per minute. If it fails, the AV node takes over with a firing rate of 40 to 60 beats per minute. If it fails, the Purkinje fibers can initiate impulses with a firing rate of 20 to 40 beats per minute. So that will show us when we're doing EKG and we're listening to a person's heart, what's functioning in the cardiac conduction system, and what kind of that would be a big issue. So let's look at the electrocardiogram. It's on page 283. And so this is a picture of what's happening in the heart. And we see it on a oscilloscope. We see it on a scope, and we see it in these waves. And so what do these waves mean? They indicate something. So the cardiac impulses generate electrical currents that spread through surrounding tissue, and they can be detected by electrodes on the body's surface. The record of these signals is called an electrocardiogram, or an ECG. So an ECG records the electrical activity or impulses. It does not record the heart's contractions. An ECG that appears normal is called normal sinus rhythm, meaning that the impulse originates in the sinoatrial or SA node. An irregular heartbeat is called an arrhythmia. The P wave represents atrial depolarization, the transmission of electrical impulses from the SA node through the atria. This occurs right before the atria contract. The PR interval represents the time it takes for the cardiac impulse to travel from the atria to the ventricles. The QRS complex represents the ventricular depolarization, the spread of electrical impulses throughout the ventricles. The ST segment represents the end of ventricular depolarization and the beginning of ventricular repolarization, and the T wave represents ventricular repolarization. So on page 283, it does discuss arrhythmias and what that means. And so I suggest you read that 283. It talks about atrial flutter, talks about premature ventricular contractions, ventricular fibrillation, and what that means and what our response should be. So, but we're going to go on to the cardiac cycle. So this cardiac cycle is the series of events from the beginning of one heartbeat to the beginning of the next. And that's what it was talking about on our objectives. when it says identify the normal cardiac cycle. So it consists of systole or contraction and diastole, relaxation. So we're going to go through that. Phase 1 is passive ventricular filling. Returning blood fills atria. The pressure increases. The atrioventricular valves open. Blood flows into the ventricles. The P wave appears on the electrocardiogram, marking the end of atrial depolarization. So this is we're starting from the beginning, and what's happening shows the P wave, and then we're going to go to phase 2. That's atrial systole. Systole means contraction. Atrioventricular valves are open. Semilunar valves are closed. The atria contract. They eject the remaining blood, and the ventricles are relaxed and fill. So phase 3 is isovolumetric contraction. The ventricles begin to contract. The semilunar valves are still closed. The pressure increases rapidly. The R wave appears on the ECG, and the first heart sound, or S1, can be heard. So the prefix, whenever you see iso, it means equal. Volumetric refers to volume. Therefore, isovolumetric refers to something having the same or equal volume. Volume of blood remains unchanged. Pressure rises because ventricles are beginning to contract. So the next phase is ventricular ejection. The semilunar valves open when pressure in the ventricles is greater than pressure in the pulmonary artery and aorta. The blood spurts out of each ventricle rapidly at first and then slows as the pressure drops. Some blood remains, that's residual volume, and the T wave occurs at the peak ventricular pressure. So phase 5 is isovolumetric ventricular relaxation. It occurs before the atrioventricular valves open and after the semilunar valves have closed. The volume of blood in the ventricles remains unchanged. The pressure falls because ventricles are relaxing. So the pressure in the ventricles decreases. The right and left ventricles receive about 70% of their blood passively. It simply flows from the right and left atria after the mitral and tricuspid valves open. Late in the filling process, both atria contract, atrial kick, to supply the ventricles with the remaining 30% of the blood. The ventricles must actively pump all their blood to the arteries. So the pressure in the ventricles decrease. The T wave ends on the electrocardiogram, and the second heart sound, S2, can be heard. Now, it's really important you view the animation on this cardiac cycle. There's a lot of information here, a lot of things happening step by step, and so review that. So what is the heart's primary pacemaker? The atrioventricular or AV node, the Purkinje fibers, the sympathetic nervous system, or the sinoatrial SA node? It's the sinoatrial or SA node. If the SA node fails, the AV node and the Purkinje fibers can initiate impulses, but they are not the primary pacemakers. The sympathetic nervous system can alter the heart's rate, but it does not act as a pacemaker. So this is part 1, and we're going to go on to part 2 of the heart, and we're going to be covering the rest of this section of the heart. We're going to be looking at cardiac output, factors affecting the heart rate, the sympathetic nervous system, the cardiac center, things that affect stroke volume, preload, contractility. So the afterload and this terminology. And we're going to cover that on the next phase, the next section, which is part 2.